the moment in your life that no one else notices. But for you, everything quietly changes. It does not come with a fight. It does not come with raised voices. And it does not come with some dramatic ending. It arrives in silence. One day, you simply stop wanting to explain yourself, not because you have nothing to say, but because something inside you finally understands that saying more will not change what is not being heard. You used to believe that if you could just find the right words, the right tone, the right timing, people would understand you, things would settle, and the connection would feel real again. But then a shift happens, subtle but undeniable, where you begin to see that the issue was never your ability to explain, and that realization does not make you cold. It makes you aware because you start to recognize a difficult truth that some people were never trying to understand you in the first place. Empaths are not just people who feel deeply, they are people who try to make sense of what they feel and then translate it in a way that others can understand. From a very early point, they develop this quiet belief that connection is something you can build if you communicate clearly enough. If something feels off, they do not withdraw. They lean in. They analyze the situation. They reflect on their emotions. And then they attempt to explain it in a way that is calm, reasonable, and considerate. They choose their words carefully. They soften their tone. They remove anything that might sound like blame, all with the intention of being understood, because to an empath, understanding is not just a preference, it is the foundation of safety in a relationship. This is where the trap begins. Because explaining feels productive, it feels like progress. Every time they revisit a conversation and try again with slightly different wording, slightly more patience, slightly more emotional control. It gives the illusion that they are moving closer to resolution. They believe that clarity will eventually dissolve confusion, that if they can just articulate their inner world well enough, the other person will finally see them accurately. And so they keep going. They explain their feelings. Then they explain why they feel that way. Then they explain the explanation, layering context on top of context in an effort to remove any possible misunderstanding. But what they do not realize at first is that this constant explaining is not actually creating understanding. It is creating dependency over time. The empath becomes the one responsible for maintaining clarity in the relationship. They become the translator, the mediator, the one who fills in the gaps whenever something is misinterpreted. If there is tension, they address it. If there is confusion, they clarify it. If there is emotional distance, they try to close it with more communication. And while this might look like emotional maturity from the outside, internally it starts to shift into something else. It becomes a pattern where they are doing most of the work to keep the connection functional, while the other person remains passive, reactive, or even dismissive. The balance quietly disappears. But because the empath is so focused on fixing and improving the dynamic, they do not immediately recognize how one-sided it has become. What makes this even more complex is that empaths are highly self-aware, which means when something does not work, their first instinct is to look inward. Instead of questioning whether the other person is unwilling to understand, they question whether they themselves have not explained it well enough. Maybe they were too emotional. Maybe they were not clear. Maybe they should have approached it differently. This internal loop reinforces the behavior because every perceived failure becomes a reason to try again, but this time better, calmer, clearer, and without realizing it, They begin to train themselves to over-explain, not because it is effective, but because it feels like the only available option. At a deeper level, explaining becomes more than communication. It becomes a way to protect the relationship. The empath starts to associate silence with risk. If they do not clarify, things might fall apart. If they do not address the misunderstanding, it might grow into something bigger. So they speak even when they are tired, even when they sense that the other person is not fully present, even when the same conversation has already happened before. They keep investing energy into words, believing that persistence will eventually lead to mutual understanding. But this is where the hidden cost begins to accumulate, because explaining is not neutral. It requires emotional effort. It requires the empath to revisit their feelings repeatedly, to organize them, to filter them, and to present them in a way that is acceptable to the other person. They are not just sharing, they are editing themselves in real time. They are constantly adjusting their delivery to avoid conflict, to reduce tension, to make their truth easier to receive. And while they may not consciously recognize it, this process slowly distances them from their raw, unfiltered experience. They begin to prioritize how their feelings are perceived over how their feelings actually are. The trap becomes complete when the empath starts believing that their ability to explain determines the quality of their relationships. If they can just do it better, everything will work. If they can just say it the right way, they will finally be understood. But this belief ties their sense of connection to something that is not fully within their control, because understanding is not created by one person speaking clearly. It requires another person who is willing to listen, to consider, and to meet that clarity with genuine attention. And when that willingness is missing, no amount of explaining can compensate for it. Still, at this stage, the empath has not fully accepted that truth yet, so they remain in the loop, investing more, refining more, and hoping that eventually their effort will be enough to bridge a gap that was never theirs to close alone. At some point, the empath begins to notice something subtle but deeply unsettling. The conversations are changing in form, but not in outcome. The words are different, the tone is more refined, the explanations are clearer. But the result stays exactly the same. They still feel misunderstood, still feel unseen, still feel like they are trying to reach someone who is not quite meeting them where they are. At first, this realization does not come all at once. It shows up as a quiet sense of frustration, a feeling that something is off but difficult to fully define. So they respond the only way they know how. They try harder. They become more patient, more precise, more thoughtful with their language. Believing that maybe this time it will land differently, they start revisiting the same topics, approaching them from new angles, adding more context, more detail, more emotional clarity. They explain not only what they feel, but why they feel it, and even why that explanation should make sense. Each conversation becomes slightly longer, slightly more layered, slightly more intentional, and with every attempt, there is a small expectation. Maybe this will be the moment where everything finally clicks into place. But instead of resolution, what they encounter is repetition. The same misunderstandings resurface, the same dismissals reappear, the same emotional gaps remain untouched. It begins to feel like they are speaking in a loop where nothing truly moves forward. This is where the pattern starts to reveal itself, but it is not immediately obvious, because on the surface, it still looks like communication is happening. There are conversations, there are responses, there are moments where it almost seems like progress is being made, but underneath that surface, there is no real shift in understanding. The other person may respond, may acknowledge, may even agree temporarily, but their behavior does not change. And behavior is where true understanding shows itself. Words can mirror comprehension, but actions expose whether it actually exists. The empath begins to sense this disconnect, that what is being said and what is being done are not aligning, but instead of stepping back, they lean in further. They begin to invest more emotional energy into closing that gap. They think maybe they need to explain it in a simpler way, or maybe they need to be even more calm, more neutral, more accommodating. They start to remove parts of their message that might be too intense, too direct, or too uncomfortable for the other person to hear. They dilute their own experience in an effort to make it easier to receive, and in doing so, they unknowingly move further away from being truly understood, because what they are presenting is no longer the full truth. It is a version of it that has been edited for acceptance. As this cycle continues, something begins to wear down internally, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow and cumulative one. The empath starts to feel the weight of repetition. It is not just the conversations themselves, it is the emotional effort behind them. Every time they revisit the same issue, they have to reopen the same feelings, reorganize the same thoughts, and present them again as if it were the first time. And when the outcome does not change, it does not just feel disappointing, it feels draining. Because effort without progress creates fatigue in a way that is difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. What makes this even more disorienting is that the empath often questions themselves in the middle of this loop. They wonder if they are expecting too much, if they are being too sensitive, if they should just let it go. They try to adjust not only their communication, but their expectations. They lower the bar, hoping that maybe less will be enough, but even then, the pattern persists. The misunderstandings do not disappear. They simply take on new forms, and that is when a deeper realization begins to surface, one that is harder to avoid. The issue is not how much they are explaining. It is that the explaining is not leading anywhere. At this stage, the empath is caught between two conflicting instincts. One part of them still believes in the power of communication, still wants to resolve, still wants to reach understanding. The other part is beginning to see the pattern for what it is, a cycle that continues not because it is working, but because it has not yet been interrupted. And that tension creates a kind of internal friction. They keep showing up to conversations that feel familiar, repeating variations of the same words, hoping for a different outcome, even as a quiet voice inside them starts to question whether that outcome is ever going to come. This is the true nature of the loop. It is not just repetition in conversation. It is repetition in effort, in hope, in emotional investment. It keeps the empath engaged, keeps them trying, keeps them believing that the next attempt might finally be the one that changes everything. But with each cycle, the gap between effort and result becomes more visible, and once that gap is seen clearly enough, it becomes impossible to ignore, because at a certain point, the question is no longer how do I explain this better? It becomes, why am I still explaining this at all? There comes a point in this cycle where something shifts, not in the other person, but in the way the empath begins to interpret what is happening. Up until now, Every failed conversation has been processed as a problem of communication, something that could be improved, refined, or corrected with more effort. But after enough repetition, after enough moments where the same misunderstanding appears no matter how clearly it is explained, a different possibility starts to surface. It is not immediate, and it is not comfortable because it challenges a belief the empath has relied on for a long time. The belief that if something is said clearly enough, it will be understood, and what begins to replace that belief is a quieter, more unsettling realization that the issue may not be a lack of understanding, but a lack of willingness to understand. This distinction changes everything, because when someone cannot understand you, it creates patience. You slow down. You adjust. You try to meet them where they are, but when someone will not understand you, no amount of adjustment makes a difference. The effort no longer leads anywhere, because the outcome has already been decided before the conversation even begins. And this is what the empath starts to notice, not just in isolated moments, but as a consistent pattern. They begin to see that certain people are not engaging with their words in a genuine way. They are not asking questions to gain clarity. They are not reflecting to find alignment. They are not showing signs of trying to see things from another perspective. Instead, they are filtering everything through a fixed perception, one that remains unchanged, no matter what is explained. At first, this realization creates resistance internally. The empath does not want to accept it, because it removes the sense of control they have been holding on to. If the problem is communication, then they can fix it. If the problem is willingness, then they cannot, and that lack of control is difficult to sit with. So there is often a period where they continue to try anyway, even as they begin to suspect that their effort is not the issue. They give one more explanation, then another, each time hoping that maybe this time will be different. But the pattern does not break. The responses remain shallow. The misunderstandings remain intact. And the same emotional disconnect continues to repeat. This is where the breaking point truly begins to form. Not as a burst of emotion, but as the slow collapse of a belief. The empath starts to see that their words are not being met with openness. They are being met with resistance, indifference, or selective listening. Parts of what they say are ignored. Parts are reinterpreted, and sometimes the entire message is reduced to something simpler and easier for the other person to dismiss. And once this becomes visible, it is difficult to go back to seeing the situation as a misunderstanding. It starts to feel intentional, not necessarily in a malicious way, but in a consistent and predictable one. They begin to notice how certain people only engage with what benefits them, how they respond when it is convenient, how they avoid deeper conversations that require accountability or emotional presence. There is a pattern of deflection where the focus is shifted away from the core issue and onto something else. There is a pattern of minimization where the empath's experience is acknowledged on the surface but not truly considered. And there is a pattern of inconsistency where words may suggest understanding, but actions repeatedly contradict it. These patterns were always there, but they were harder to see when the empath was focused on fixing the communication itself. What makes this realization so powerful is not just what it reveals about the other person, but what it reveals about the empath's own behavior. They start to see how much energy they have been investing into trying to earn something that was never being offered freely. Understanding, in its true form, requires willingness, attention, and mutual effort. It cannot be extracted through persistence. And yet, for so long, they have been treating it as something that could be achieved if they just tried hard enough. That belief begins to fall apart, and with it, the motivation to continue the same pattern starts to weaken. This does not immediately lead to action, but it creates clarity, and clarity changes the way everything is experienced. Conversations that once felt hopeful now feel predictable. Responses that once felt confusing now make sense in a different way. The empath is no longer asking, "Why are they not understanding me?" They are asking, "Are they even trying to?" And once that question is asked honestly, the answer becomes harder to ignore because it is reflected not in what is said, but in what consistently happens. This is the real turning point. Not because it ends the dynamic right away, but because it removes the illusion that has been sustaining it. The empath is no longer fully invested in the idea that more explaining will solve the problem. They begin to see that the gap they have been trying to close is not a gap in clarity, it is a gap in willingness. And that is not something they can bridge alone. Once that truth is recognized, even if only partially, something inside them begins to shift. The effort becomes heavier, the conversations feel different, and the cycle that once felt necessary starts to feel optional. Once the empath begins to see that the issue is not a lack of clarity, but a lack of willingness, something inside them starts to wear down in a way that is difficult to immediately recognize. It is not sudden, it is not dramatic, and it does not announce itself with intensity. It builds slowly through repetition. Every conversation that leads nowhere, every moment where their words are heard but not truly received, adds another layer to a growing sense of exhaustion. And what they begin to understand is that explaining is not just communication, it is effort, it is energy. It is a form of emotional labor that has been quietly draining them over time. Because explaining at the level an empath does it is never simple. It is not just saying what they feel, it is processing what they feel, organizing it, softening it, and delivering it in a way that will not create resistance. They are constantly adjusting themselves in real time, choosing words that will not trigger defensiveness, removing parts of their experience that might feel too heavy, and reshaping their truth into something more acceptable. It becomes a performance of emotional precision where they are not only responsible for expressing themselves, but also for managing how the other person might react to what is being expressed. And that level of awareness, while it may seem like strength, comes at a cost. Over time, the empath starts to notice that they are carrying the weight of both sides of the conversation. They are thinking about what they feel and at the same time thinking about how it will be perceived. They are anticipating responses, adjusting tone, preparing explanations before misunderstandings even happen. It becomes a continuous loop of self-monitoring, where nothing is said without being filtered first. And when that filtered version of their truth still fails to create understanding, it does not just feel ineffective, it feels invalidating, because it sends a subtle message that even after all that effort, what they feel still does not fully matter in the way it should. This is where the exhaustion deepens, because the empath is not just tired of talking, they are tired of carrying the emotional responsibility of making the interaction work. They are tired of being the one who has to bring clarity, bring calm, bring resolution, while the other person remains inconsistent or disengaged. And yet, because this pattern has been repeated so many times, it feels almost automatic. They find themselves slipping back into explanation even when they already know how it will end. They explain, because it has become a reflex, not because it is still effective. And that is where the internal conflict begins to intensify. Part of them is aware that nothing is changing, that the same effort is producing the same result, but another part still feels compelled to try because stopping feels unfamiliar. Stopping feels like giving up, like letting the connection deteriorate without resistance. So they continue, even as the energy behind their words starts to fade. The explanations become less driven by hope and more driven by habit. And slowly, something important begins to shift. Not in what they say, but in how it feels to say it. There is a moment, often quiet and easily overlooked, where the empath hears themselves explaining and realizes that they are no longer fully present in their own words. They are going through the motions, repeating patterns that once felt meaningful but now feel empty. The emotional connection to what they are saying begins to weaken because they have said it too many times without it leading to anything real. And in that moment, a different kind of awareness begins to form. They start to see that the effort they have been investing is not just unreciprocated, it is unsustainable. This is the true cost of emotional labor. It does not just drain energy, it disconnects the empath from themselves. Because in constantly adjusting their expression to fit the other person, they begin to move further away from their own unfiltered experience. They start to question whether it is even worth expressing certain things at all. Not because those things are not important, but because the effort required to make them understood feels disproportionate to the outcome, and that imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The empath begins to feel a kind of fatigue that is not just physical or mental, but emotional at its core. It is the fatigue of trying to be understood in spaces where understanding is not being actively offered. It is the fatigue of carrying conversations that should have been shared. And most of all, it is the fatigue of realizing that their effort has been sustaining a dynamic that is not evolving. And once that realization settles in, something starts to change. Not all at once, but enough to create distance between the impulse to explain and the choice to remain silent, because for the first time, the empath begins to question not how to explain better, but whether explaining is worth the cost at all. When the empath begins to pull back from constant explaining, something unfamiliar starts to take its place. And at first it does not feel like strength, it feels like uncertainty. For a long time, their sense of emotional stability has been tied to feedback from others, to the subtle confirmations that what they feel is valid, reasonable, and understood. Even when they were not consciously seeking approval, there was still an underlying reliance on it. They would express something and then watch for the response, not just to see if they were heard, but to see if what they felt made sense in someone else's eyes. And when that response was missing, inconsistent, or dismissive, it did not just affect the interaction, it began to affect how they viewed their own internal experience. This is where validation becomes a quiet dependency, not in an obvious or exaggerated way, but in small, repeated moments where the empath looks outward to confirm what they already feel inwardly. They begin to measure the accuracy of their emotions based on how others react to them. If someone agrees, it reinforces their sense of clarity. If someone disagrees or minimizes, it introduces doubt. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in how they process their own reality. Instead of asking, "What do I feel?" they begin asking, "Is what I feel acceptable?" Instead of trusting their instincts, they start negotiating with them, adjusting them sometimes even overriding them to maintain connection or avoid conflict. But when the cycle of explaining begins to break, when they stop seeking understanding in the same way, that external feedback loop starts to weaken, and at first, that absence feels uncomfortable. There is a kind of silence that replaces the constant exchange, and in that silence, the empath is left alone with their own perceptions without immediate confirmation. It can feel disorienting because they are no longer calibrating their experience through someone else's response. There is no quick reassurance, no external anchor to stabilize what they feel. And for someone who has been used to that dynamic for so long, this shift can feel like stepping into unfamiliar territory without clear direction. But something else begins to happen in that space, something quieter but far more stable. Without the constant need to explain or justify, the empath starts to observe their own patterns more clearly. They begin to notice how often their initial instincts were accurate, even in moments where they doubted them. They remember situations where something felt off from the beginning, but they talked themselves out of it. They recall times when they sensed a lack of respect, inconsistency, or misalignment, but chose to ignore it in order to preserve the relationship. And as these memories resurface, they begin to form a different kind of understanding, one that does not rely on anyone else's agreement. This is where self-trust starts to rebuild, not as a sudden decision, but as a gradual recognition. The empath begins to see that their ability to perceive emotional dynamics was never the issue. What was missing was not accuracy, but permission. They had been waiting for someone else to confirm what they already knew. And once that becomes clear, something shifts internally again. They stop asking for validation in the same way, not because they no longer value connection, but because they no longer require agreement to feel grounded in their own experience. They begin to sit with their feelings without immediately translating them for someone else. They allow themselves to acknowledge what they sense without rushing to make it understandable or acceptable. And in doing so, they reconnect with a more direct form of awareness, one that is not filtered through external reactions. This changes the way they make decisions. Instead of adjusting themselves to maintain harmony, they start to evaluate whether the situation aligns with what they already feel to be true. The question is no longer, how do I make this make sense to them? It becomes, does this make sense to me? This shift is subtle, but it is foundational, because once the empath starts trusting their own perception, the need to over-explain begins to dissolve naturally. There is less urgency to correct every misunderstanding, less pressure to ensure that everyone sees things the same way. They begin to understand that disagreement does not automatically invalidate their experience, and that someone else's inability or unwillingness to understand does not define the accuracy of what they feel. That realization creates a kind of internal stability that was not there before, and with that stability comes a different kind of confidence, not loud or performative, but quiet and consistent. Their words become more direct because they are no longer trying to convince, they are simply expressing. There is less emotional strain behind what they say because they are not carrying the responsibility of making it land perfectly. They speak when it feels necessary, and they remain silent when it does not, without the same level of internal conflict. And perhaps most importantly, they begin to trust that their experience has value, even if it is not immediately recognized by others. This is the turning point where the empath stops outsourcing their sense of reality and starts anchoring it within themselves. And once that process begins, everything that follows, the silence, the discernment, the detachment, becomes not a strategy, but a natural extension of that trust As self-trust begins to take root, something else starts to change in a way that is often misunderstood from the outside. The empath becomes quieter, not because they have nothing to say, and not because they have lost their ability to communicate, but because they no longer feel the same urgency to fill every space with explanation. Before, silence felt risky. It felt like something that needed to be avoided, because without clarification, things might fall apart or be misunderstood. But now, silence starts to feel different. It becomes intentional, controlled, and deeply strategic. At first, this shift is subtle. The empath pauses a little longer before responding. They allow conversations to unfold without immediately stepping in to correct or clarify. They stop chasing every misunderstanding the moment it appears. Instead of reacting, they observe, and that pause creates something that was not there before. Space. Space in a conversation. Space in a dynamic. Space for the other person to reveal themselves without being guided or corrected. And in that space, patterns begin to surface more clearly than they ever did when the empath was actively trying to manage the interaction, because when you remove constant explanation, you also remove the structure that was holding the conversation together. Without that structure, the other person is left to respond based on their own level of awareness, their own intentions, and their own capacity to engage. And that is where the real information is. The empath begins to notice who leans in and tries to understand without being prompted, and who defaults to assumption, defensiveness, or indifference. They start to see who becomes curious in the absence of explanation, and who becomes uncomfortable or dismissive. And that distinction reveals far more than any conversation ever could. This is why silence, when used with awareness, becomes one of the most precise tools available. It does not force anything. It does not control the other person directly, but it creates the conditions where truth becomes visible, without the empath constantly smoothing things over, softening tension, or providing clarity. There is nothing left to hide behind. People begin to show their patterns more openly. The way they interpret, the way they react, the way they either engage or withdraw becomes easier to read, and once those patterns are seen clearly, they cannot be unseen. What makes this shift powerful is that it is not passive. From the outside, it may look like the empath is simply saying less, but internally, they are more aware than ever. They are choosing when to speak and when not to, based not on fear or avoidance, but on alignment. They are no longer speaking to manage someone else's perception. They are speaking only when it serves clarity, truth, or necessity. And when none of those are present, they are comfortable, allowing silence to do the work. This also changes the emotional dynamic of interactions. Before, the empath carried a large portion of the emotional responsibility, making sure the conversation stayed balanced, making sure nothing escalated unnecessarily, making sure misunderstandings were addressed. Now, that responsibility is no longer theirs alone. By stepping back, they allow the other person to either meet them with the same level of awareness or reveal that they cannot. And that shift removes a significant amount of emotional strain, because they are no longer compensating for what is missing on the other side. Of course, this silence is not always received well. Some people will notice the change and feel unsettled by it. They may push for explanations, try to provoke a reaction, or interpret the silence as distance or rejection. But what they are actually encountering is a boundary, one that does not need to be explained to be effective. The empath is no longer available in the same way, no longer stepping in to maintain the dynamic at their own expense. And for those who relied on that pattern, the absence of it can feel uncomfortable. But for the empath, this silence brings something new, a sense of control that does not come from managing others, but from managing their own energy and attention. They are no longer reacting automatically, no longer pulled into every emotional shift in the environment. They choose their responses. They choose their involvement. And sometimes they choose not to engage at all. And that choice is where the strength lies, because it is no longer driven by fear of losing connection, but by clarity about what kind of connection is actually worth maintaining. Over time, this way of interacting becomes more natural. Silence is no longer something they have to think about. It becomes their default in situations where words would only repeat old patterns. And in that default, there is a quiet confidence. They do not need to prove their perspective. They do not need to defend their experience. They do not need to correct every misunderstanding. They understand that not every gap needs to be closed, and not every conversation needs to be continued. This is the moment where silence stops being an absence and becomes a statement. It communicates awareness without confrontation, presence without overextension, and boundaries without explanation. It says, without words, that they see what is happening and are choosing not to participate in it the same way anymore. And once that kind of silence takes hold, the dynamic can no longer function as it did before, because the energy that sustained it is no longer being provided. And from that point forward, everything begins to change. Once silence becomes natural, not something the empath has to think about, but something that happens automatically, the final shift begins to take shape. And this is where everything changes at the deepest level. It is the stage of detachment. From the outside, this is often misunderstood, because people associate detachment with being cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. But what is actually happening is something far more refined. The empath is not disconnecting from emotion. They are disconnecting from entanglement. They still feel, they still perceive, they still understand, but they no longer merge themselves into every situation or carry what does not belong to them. Before this point, their identity was closely tied to engagement. They felt responsible for maintaining connection, resolving tension, and holding emotional balance. Even when it came at a personal cost, they leaned in. They gave more. They tried to fix, to explain, to stabilize, and in doing so, they often blurred the line between empathy and overextension. But after moving through the cycles of explaining, the exhaustion of emotional labor, the rebuilding of self-trust, and the clarity that came through silence, something becomes undeniable. Not every situation requires their involvement, and not every person deserves their energy. This realization does not come with resentment. It comes with precision. The empath begins to recognize patterns almost instantly, not through long analysis, but through a kind of sharpened awareness that has been built over time, a certain tone, a familiar inconsistency, a repeated behavior, and they can already see where it leads. And because they can see where it leads, they no longer feel the need to follow it to the end. They do not wait for things to escalate. They do not wait for confirmation through repetition. They trust the signal early, and that trust allows them to step back before they become fully invested again. Detachment, at this stage, is not a decision they have to force. It becomes a natural response. They stop chasing conversations that do not move forward. They stop revisiting the same issues that have already revealed their outcome. They stop investing energy into dynamics that require them to shrink, adjust, or overextend just to keep them alive. And this is not because they have stopped caring, it is because they have started caring in a different way. They care about their energy, their clarity, and their internal stability more than they care about preserving every connection. You can see this shift in how they behave. They respond when it feels aligned, but they do not pursue endlessly. They listen, but they do not absorb everything as if it were theirs to carry. They remain present, but they are no longer pulled into every emotional current around them. Their involvement becomes selective, and that selectivity creates a different kind of presence, one that is lighter, more grounded, and far less reactive. They are not trying to manage the experience anymore. They are simply choosing whether to participate in it. What is interesting is how this affects the people around them. Those who were used to having constant access to the empath's attention and energy begin to notice the absence of it. The immediate responses are gone. The long explanations are gone. The effort that once held the dynamic together is no longer there. And that creates a shift. Some people will try to pull them back into old patterns, revisiting familiar conversations, testing boundaries, or creating situations that used to trigger engagement. But the empath does not respond the same way anymore. Not because they are trying to prove a point, but because the internal alignment that guided their old behavior is no longer there. This is where detachment shows its true nature. It is not an act. It is not a strategy. It is a consequence of understanding. Once you clearly see what something costs you, and once you recognize that the cost is not being balanced by something real or reciprocal, the decision to step back becomes almost automatic. There is no need for dramatic exits or emotional declarations. The distance happens naturally, quietly, and consistently. And in that quiet distance, there is a sense of control that was never available before. The empath's emotional state is no longer tied to how others behave. It is no longer reactive to whether someone understands them, agrees with them, or meets them at a certain level. If connection is present, they engage. If it is not, they remain unaffected. That is the difference. Their sense of stability now comes from within, not from the external dynamics they are part of, and that internal stability allows them to move through the world with a different kind of confidence, one that does not need to be validated or reinforced by others. Over time, this shift begins to change the kind of connections they experience. They are no longer available for dynamics that rely on imbalance, inconsistency, or emotional dependency. Without trying, they begin to attract interactions that are more reciprocal, more grounded, and more aligned with who they have become, not because they are seeking something better, but because they are no longer tolerating what is not. And that is the final transformation. The empath does not lose their ability to connect. They refine it. They do not stop caring. They stop overextending, and in that refinement, they return to a version of themselves that is both deeply aware and fully intact,